horror stories coming out of Canada's euthanasia regime. I'm sick of covering these stories, and you may be sick of hearing them, but I think it's really important for us to understand what is actually happening, especially because this is being debated in the US and in the UK. Canada's euthanasia activists and suicide activists always promised the public that the path to medical aid in dying, as they now call it, would be a narrow path with high guardrails. They were lying. It's a 4-lane highway, and there's nobody patrolling it. And not a week goes by without some grim new development, and the Trudeau government refuses to listen to those who have been now hoarsely sounding the alarm. It does get tiresome to cover these horror stories, but one of the reasons it's so essential to cover these stories as they come out is because of what these stories tell us about Canada's euthanasia regime. And the bill just proposed in the United Kingdom to legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia there essentially proposes the Canadian system. And so a glimpse into Canada's present is also a look into the UK's future if they choose to take this path. And the same goes for those American states that are also considering euthanasia. Thankfully, a glimmer of good news is that the governor of Delaware recently vetoed their assisted suicide bill. So I want to start with a report by the Associated Press that was published on October 16. And in the story, they cover the questions euthanasia providers in Canada are struggling with and discussing on their private forums. One of these stories featured a homeless man being killed by lethal injection. So let me quote directly from the AP here. One doctor wrote that although his patient had a serious lung disease, his suffering was mostly because he is homeless, in debt, and cannot tolerate the idea of long-term care of any kind. A respondent questioned whether the fear of living in the nursing home was truly intolerable, as it must be to qualify under Canada's system. Another said the prospect of looking at the wall or ceiling waiting to be fed to have diapers changed was sufficiently painful to qualify. The man was eventually euthanized. One provider said that any suggestion they should provide patients with better housing options before offering euthanasia seems unrealistic and hence cruel amid a national housing crisis. So in other words, this is a frank admission that because of Canada's current standard of living, what we're seeing is impoverished people who feel they have no choice but to die at the end of the needle simply because they cannot get the housing they need, cannot get the disability care they need, cannot get the long-term care that they need. Another one of the stories reported by the AP featured providers debating whether or not obesity made somebody eligible for assisted suicide. Listen to this. One woman with severe obesity described herself as a, quote, useless body taking up space. She'd lost interest in activities, became socially withdrawn, and said she had, quote, no purpose, according to the doctor who reviewed her case. Another physician, however, reasoned that the euthanasia was warranted because obesity is, quote, a medical condition which is indeed grievous and irremediable. And so because the reasonably foreseeable death standard has been removed from Canada's euthanasia law, and doctors are no longer required to only dispense lethal injections to those who actually have a prognosis, a terminal prognosis, virtually anything qualifies at this point because depression is grievous and sometimes irremediable insofar as that it's a long-term condition. And now what we're seeing is that this slippery slope is slick with blood, and the euthanasia providers are willing, in many cases, to euthanize almost anybody who asks. I think probably the most chilling story of all is the case of a woman who was very obviously pushed into accepting euthanasia. Let me read this from the AP here. When a health provider inquired whether anyone had euthanized patients for blindness, one provider reported 4 such cases. In one, they said an elderly man who saw only shadows was his wife's caregiver when he requested euthanasia, but he wanted her to die with him. Listen to this part very carefully. The couple had several appointments with an assessor before the wife, quote, finally agreed to be killed, the provider said. Not my words, that's the Associated Press. She died unexpectedly just days before the scheduled euthanasia. But listen to that again. Before 4 meetings, and then she finally agreed to be killed. This is somebody who essentially broke down and finally assented to being euthanized. This is somebody who was pushed into euthanasia. And other providers also cited examples of people being euthanized for grief, which again can also be a grievous and irremediable condition. It should be obvious to anybody watching what is going on in Canada that there are no brakes on this train. And it keeps on getting worse. I'm just going to cite a few stories that have come out this month in October. Linda Matterford, the newly elected president of the Regina Catholic Women's League, will be sharing her family's experience coming up here at the Catholic Health Association of Saskatchewan's convention. And she tells the story about how her mother passed away, and then her family moved their father into a care facility in Saskatoon. And here's what she said. The very day after, we got a blanket email inviting us to come to a presentation in the dining room. And what was the topic? Accessing euthanasia. Manafort said she was deeply disturbed that the people they had just entrusted their father to, the caretakers they were trusting with their father's life and well-being, they'd been there for a day, and they got an email suggesting that they attend a presentation where access to euthanasia would be laid out. And Manafort added that, quote, there is a push from the top down, that if you aren't open to the idea, that is euthanasia, you should be. I worry for the people who feel the pressure of, well, my doctor advised it, or someone with a clipboard kept on coming around and asking, end quote. And we know many stories like that. We've covered them at the Bridgehead. We've covered them on this podcast. There are people who are consistently over and over and over again offered euthanasia by medical professionals who are essentially telling them, your life is not worth living. We have the solution for you. All you've got to do is assent. Another story, and this one is just chilling, and just put yourself or one of your loved ones in this position for a second. This was covered this month, again, by The Telegraph, a UK paper, so the UK politicians who have to vote on assisted suicide know that these stories are happening. Relay the experience of a Canadian woman who was about to undergo life-saving cancer surgery. She was getting a mastectomy. She was offered assisted suicide by doctors as she was about to enter the operating room for her mastectomy. As she was about to enter the operating room. Consider that. Unbelievable. The people at their most vulnerable, feeling like a burden. People who are recognized they need a lot of care. People who need other people to help keep them alive, to care for them. These are the people at those moments in their life that are most difficult, where they are the most vulnerable, where they are the most dependent. Then they're being offered by their very caretakers, by medical professionals, the opportunity to receive euthanasia. And as I quoted from the Associated Press there, people are being euthanized for being poor, they're being euthanized for being blind, they're being euthanized for grief, they're being euthanized for disability. But none of these stories seem to give euthanasia activists any pause. Instead, they're constantly pushing for more. On October 16, the Financial Post published an editorial by Andrew Roman titled this, quote, you should be able to reserve MAiD service. Quebec is going to let people pre-order medical assistance in dying. Ottawa shouldn't try. Stop it. People have that right. Anyone still arguing about rights as Canadian physicians euthanize the most vulnerable should not be taken seriously. But here's Roman arguing in the opening paragraph of his piece that if we don't permit this, that is allowing people ahead of time to say that they want MAiD if this happens to them, all kinds of elderly people with dementia will not be killed, which Roman clearly thinks is a tragedy. Let me quote from him directly here. As Canada's population continues to age, demand for MAiD, medical aid in dying, will only increase. But with rates of dementia also increasing, the cognitive ability of patients to consent becomes a barrier. The prevalence of dementia more than doubles every 5 years among seniors, rising from less than 1% in those aged 65 to 69 to about 25% among people 85 and older. In other words, what Roman's saying here is if we don't pass this policy, if we don't allow people to sign advance directives, then there's a ton of people with dementia that won't die by lethal injection. And let me tell you a story for a moment. These sorts of things are now happening in other countries. In the Netherlands, there was a woman who had allegedly expressed a desire for euthanasia, although she had changed her mind and gone back and forth several times, was being cared for in a nursing home and had dementia. The caretaker said she was a very happy woman. She played games with other residents of the nursing home. She was not suffering, but the family argued that she would not have wanted to live this way and that because she had dementia, she should be euthanized. But it didn't go really well because the woman didn't want to be euthanized. And so first they laced her coffee with a sedative, but when she was first knocked cold, she woke up as they were about to lethally inject her. And so the family held her down while the doctor injected her with poison and killed her. They held this old woman down and then lethally injected her, killing her. This case actually went before the Dutch courts. The Dutch justice system concluded that the doctor and the family had done nothing wrong. This is the kind of thing, by the way, that will happen if Andrew Roman and people like him get their way. Let me quote another paragraph here, revealing the sort of breathtaking ignorance of how Canada's euthanasia regime has unfolded. Roman wrote this, quote, "There is no good reason why, with the numerous safeguards in Ottawa's and Quebec's laws, patients should be precluded from making advance request before their condition renders them incapable of giving consent, and no good reason why their physicians should become criminals for honoring their patients' duly stipulated advance request." No good reason why? Safeguards? What a joke. And this is published in one of our major newspapers. It's like he hasn't read any of the stories that have come out on this stuff. He concludes, MAiD is also regulated under provincial law and by the same medical colleagues that regulate abortion. Colleges, pardon me, not colleagues, that regulate abortion. Ottawa should amend the criminal code to exempt MAiD altogether and, as is in the case with abortion, let the medical profession do its work in accordance with provincial regulation and patients' wishes, end quote. So there you have it. That is, it's honest, I'll give it that. The final goal of euthanasia activists is euthanasia on demand, doctor's license to kill. And the thing is, we do not have to ask ourselves what will happen if people like Andrew Roman and the folks at Dying with Dignity get their way, because it's happening already. It's happening already. We have no excuse. We're walking into this with our eyes wide open. And so are the legislatures in the UK who are considering this. So are the lawmakers in the US who are considering this. We know what will happen. We know what this will do to the vulnerable. And if we make this choice, we are deciding to put vulnerable, disabled, elderly, sick people in this position. And that's just the truth. Thanks everyone for watching that clip. If you'd like to check out our content on other platforms, you can find us on Rumble, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever else you get your content. Be sure to like and subscribe to this channel and spread the clip around if you like the content. Thanks so much.